The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
Hello, this is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org radio and another week of global alert news for September 19th, losing my days, 2015. Again, as always, hard to keep track of the days when every day seems to be a deeper descent into the asylum of insanity that we all find ourselves surrounded in, that a great many still don't want to acknowledge or accept, but they'll have to soon. Last week we covered the true powers behind the forming, funding, and arming of groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Very different story than what mainstream media has or will tell us. Last week we covered some of the glaring, unanswered questions about 9/11. Those questions are quite clear if people would simply open their eyes and watch video footage, for example, of Building 7, as we did last week. I suggested people do. It takes 30 seconds to do that online, and I challenge anybody to watch that building and try to accept the official lie that it fell down from couches and chairs burning in the first floor. Again, Building 7 was the third building to collapse on 9/11, something most people don't even know happened. Last week we covered that 9/11 was the, quote, new Pearl Harbor, a statement made, a term used by a think tank called PNAC, Project for a New American Century, over a year prior to the 9/11 demolitions. I should call them what they are. Primary power structure players stated again that they needed a new Pearl Harbor to galvanize the populations of the United States to support an agenda of expanded militarization and occupation. Strategic countries in the Middle East were the target. And again, if we look at any crime, we should look at the motive. Who benefited? Who benefited from that crime? I don't argue that it was done by terrorists, but who were those terrorists in this case? And we should all investigate. I'm not stating we know conclusions for certain, but we can definitely say the official story is not supported by science, and we have 2,500 architects and engineers to tell us that. So, as we continued on last week as well, the life support systems of the biosphere is something I always will bring up on this show, because without those life support systems, nothing else matters. Nothing. And as we look at mainstream media every single day, it's simply one scenario of idiocracy after another, isn't it? It doesn't matter what channel you put on. Sometimes I wonder if intelligent life was examining us from somewhere else in the universe and they watched a few hours of mainstream media, they would conclude there's no intelligent life on this planet. I mean, it's astounding how far from any semblance of reality we've drifted on what we watch on mainstream TV, while literally the planet is imploding into the sixth great mass extinction now, oceans dying, biosphere imploding, hundreds of homes going up in flames, and we talked about that last week. Again, I've gone over again and again with articles on GeoEngineering Watch the direct effect climate engineering has on increased forest fires. Very direct effect, single greatest effect, disrupting the hydrological cycle, i.e. the rain cycle, drying out the atmosphere. These particles are desiccants. They absorb and accrete all available moisture. That sucks the moisture out of everything. Does anybody wonder why there's no dew in the morning so often now in so many places? It disrupts evaporation because the direct sunlight is disrupted. Direct sunlight is necessary for evaporation. It alters wind patterns. These are incendiary materials. The materials named in geoengineering patents are incendiary materials. They burn. And we know these materials are coming down because we have the lab tests to prove it. Several dozen, about 5 dozen in Shasta County alone, and Siskiyou County as well. So we have, again, the disrupted rain cycle, shredded ozone layer, a known consequence of geoengineering, much more intense UV, that burns the trees, bioavailable metals, which are highly toxic to the root systems, a dried out atmosphere. All these conditions combined, we have more dry lightning, by the way, because The rainfall is diminished. The atmosphere is more electrically conductive. That means more lightning. We have all the worst scenarios, all fueled by climate engineering. And now we have total fire apocalyptic cataclysms. I encourage listeners to search online. Geoengineering is causing drought and fueling fires. See what you find. We've documented this over and over. Science studies document the drying out effect of climate engineering. On that note, let's look at a headline that was from a few days ago. MIT study warns about the dangers of geoengineering and weather modification. By Derek Brose. I salute him for this article. It's helpful for shining a light where it desperately needs to be shined. The article begins, as humanity works to avoid further environmental and ecological destruction to the planet, scientists continue to search for possible solutions to the numerous issues facing our species. One of these proposed solutions has been the science of geoengineering. According to a 2013 congressional report, quoting from the report now, the term geoengineering describes an array of technologies through large-scale and deliberate modifications of Earth's energy balance to reduce temperatures and counteract anthropogenic climate change. We're going to play God with the weather. That's what that definition means. Large-scale and deliberate modification of Earth's energy balance. Who gave them the right to do that? And they have absolutely no idea. I assure you, after 12 years of solid, constant, in-depth research on this issue, they have absolutely no regard for the overall consequences. And should this be any surprise, the example I've given over and over, the pharmaceutical industry, the commercials that anybody that's even halfway conscious would see through to take a pharmaceutical for a particular ailment and get 20 or 30 or 40 side effects that are much worse than what you attempted to treat in the first place. This is the same mentality that's running climate engineering. The piece continues. Geoengineering is seen as a controversial solution. That's to say the least. That controversy is likely to deepen following a recent study from MIT. For those who don't know who MIT is, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, world-renowned research institute. Their center, the MIT Center for Global Change Science, and the Department of Earth, Atmospheric, and Planetary Sciences. The study published in Nature's Scientific Reports has found that ocean fertilization geoengineering would alter global rainfall patterns and affect water resources. Why should we be surprised to hear that? How can you possibly throw a massive wrench into the climate system and Earth's life support systems and not expect to get a bad result? And we have protracted drought happening all over the globe. Yes, we have deluge as well, but we have more protracted drought, and you can't have that on a warming planet without a very big factor that's not being acknowledged. That factor is climate engineering, saturating the atmosphere with light-scattering, moisture-absorbing particulates. The piece from Derek Brose goes on. Ocean fertilization is a type of geoengineering that seeks to mimic the ability of phytoplankton, the microalgae at the base of most oceanic food webs. The ability of phytoplankton to photosynthesize sunlight. As the phytoplankton absorbs carbon dioxide, they also release dimethyl sulfide, DMS, into the atmosphere, which can form sulfate aerosols and reflect sunlight and cool the climate. Geoengineers hope to reproduce this natural process and thus reflect sunlight and cool Earth. According to phys.org, this is a reputable site online I'm familiar with, these simulations found that increased DMS emissions would actually lead to an increase of 1.2 degrees Celsius and substantial reduction in precipitation for some regions. Why would it affect some regions and not others? And again, this is where the consequences of climate engineering have never been truly regarded by the military-industrial complex. I'll continue with this study from MIT. Chen Wang, a Chinese scientist, a co-author of the study, and senior researcher scientist at MIT's Center for Global Change and Science and the Department of Earth said the study was the first in-depth analysis of ocean fertilization that has highlighted the potential danger of impacting rainfall. How can you, again, throw a wrench into a highly complicated system and not expect a very negative result? Continuing with the study, Benjamin Grandley, a senior member in Wang's group who configured the model simulations and analyzed the data, said it would lead to dangerous changes in global weather. Precipitation, this is quoting from the report and quoting from the main researcher, precipitation would also decline worldwide, and some parts of the world would be worse off. Europe, the Horn of Africa, and Pakistan may receive less rainfall than they have historically. And this is an interesting point. The United States is not mentioned because researchers in the United States know better than to mention that any program that their government may be involved with could be negatively affecting the United States, because they know that much of the population doesn't care if it affects somebody somewhere else, as long as it doesn't affect them. So many of these researchers know better than to state it would affect America. Why wouldn't it affect America? Is there something magical about our particular location in the world? Of course not. So we know it's affecting America horrifically. We have a snowpack that's stated at 500-year lows in the Sierras. That figure's out of a hat. We don't know how far back anything like this has ever happened. And certainly, based on paleo data, it's likely much, much bigger record than just a 500-year record. Continuing with the report, the lower rainfall could reduce water resources considerably and threaten the environment and livelihoods of animals and people in the affected regions. This is so important to remember. This study only addresses the highly negative impact on rainfall from ocean fertilization. Solar radiation management has an even greater impact in regard to reducing overall global precipitation. This is what we see happening in our skies. So this report talks about only the ocean fertilization, by the way, which means to dump iron oxide again into the ocean to create a plankton bloom, to suck up CO2 in the ocean that's already too acidic. And it doesn't even take into account the massive global atmospheric spraying, which is an even bigger impact on precipitation. Is it any wonder that the hydrological cycle, the rain cycle, is completely derailed? Again, with Sierra snowpacks at 500-year lows, or likely much worse than that. Continuing with the MIT report, the MIT team is not the first to ring the alarm bells when it comes to geoengineering and other forms of weather modification. Although a number of authorities have warned about the dangers of geoengineering techniques, the risks are seen as secondary to the perceived risks of climate change. The interesting thing to note is that although proponents of geoengineering hail it as the solution to climate change and sustaining life, studies show that geoengineering could actually have the reversed effect and actually heat the Earth. We have enough data to say conclusively that's exactly what's happening. And it doesn't take loads of research and study to come to this conclusion as well. We have the concept of reflecting heat from these particulates, which also trap heat. And once you disrupt the hydrological cycle, and we have fires around the globe like we have happening right now, it has a tremendous heating effect on the planet that triggers many more downstream feedback loops. The soot goes into the atmosphere. The northern latitude boreal forest fires drop soot on the ice. The ice becomes black. The black ice starts to absorb heat, which starts to melt the ice much, much faster. It loses its albedo, its reflectivity. Once the ice melts, especially off the ocean, which starts to then absorb much more heat, which starts to thaw methane. The methane migrates to the atmosphere where it becomes an extremely powerful greenhouse gas and heats the planet even more. Again, climate engineering has totally disrupted Earth's natural energy balance more than the other anthropogenic sources of damage, and those are horrific sources as well. I'm not saying that as I've said many times, we have damaged the planet from too many directions to count. Anyone who doesn't realize that or accept that is not looking at reality. But climate engineering being the greatest source of damage of all. Continuing with the report, in February of 2015, an international committee of scientists released a report stating that geoengineering techniques are not a viable alternative to reducing greenhouse gas. In other words, it doesn't work. It won't work. Why is that a surprise? Again, that saturating the atmosphere with highly toxic, electrically conductive particulates and then microwaving those particulates, because that's exactly what they're doing with facilities like HARP, which causes those particulates to actually generate heat as they're trying to manipulate the jet stream. Is it any surprise that this activity would cause a problem? What could go wrong? That seems to be the attitude of the military-industrial complex. They just keep doubling down. Again, continuing with the MIT article, the committee report called for further research and understanding of various geoengineering techniques, including carbon dioxide removal schemes and solar radiation management before implementation. Denial, always denial, as if these programs aren't going on already, that anybody who chooses to open their eyes can see. Continuing, the scientists found that solar radiation management, or albedo modification, albedo means to create an increased reflectivity in Earth's atmosphere to reflect some of the sun's incoming thermal energy. Albedo modification techniques are likely to present serious known and possible unknown environmental, social, and political risks, including the possibility of being deployed unilaterally. Of course it's being deployed unilaterally by many different countries, all pushing and pulling on the climate system at the same time. Is it any wonder our climate system is disintegrating? It should be no wonder. No wonder at all. And again, this is from an MIT report. I want people to understand that what we see happening in our skies is not speculation or theory. We have film footage of these aircraft spraying at altitude military tankers. And just because you don't see horizon-to-horizon trails doesn't mean spraying is not going on. With the precipitation that's passing over Northern California on the 17th, 18th, or 16th and 17th, I live in a very rural location, and whenever there's moisture passing over, all I can hear, because I don't have any other sounds to distract me, all I can hear is aircraft going over. It sounds like I'm at the end of an LAX runway, one after another after another. The traffic is unbelievable. What does this do as they spray particulates? It puts too many condensation nuclei into the storm system. Droplets can't combine and fall as rain, so instead of having any significant rainfall, you have drips and drizzles, and the rain, in effect, is migrated further inland. This is science fact. I challenge anyone listening to search online, geoengineering will reduce rainfall. Read about it, learn about it. And that's exactly what we have happening. And we have countries around the globe, as this report states, the fear of that will engage in climate engineering unilaterally. Certainly it's been happening with the major powers for a very long time. Continuing with the report, another danger of manipulating the weather is the loss of blue skies. How obvious is that one? How many people have seen a truly blue sky lately? In recent decades even, it's happened so slowly people have forgotten what skies should look like and what clouds should look like. According to a report by New Scientist, Ben Kravitz of the Carnegie Institution for Science has shown that releasing sulfate aerosols high in the atmosphere would scatter sunlight. That's what the primary purpose is for geoengineering patents, is to scatter sunlight. He says this could decrease the amount of sunlight that hits the ground by 20% and make the sky appear more hazy. Let's consider what this scientist says. Do we need a science study to know that if you put light-scattering particles in the atmosphere, it will decrease the amount of direct sunlight hitting the ground and the sky would appear more hazy? Do we really need a lot of academicians, degrees, and studies to come to that conclusion? This is the kind of academia we have. They would need a 10-year study and 20 scientists to come to the most basic conclusions. That's what they're trained to do, is to confuse issues on conclusions that should be obvious. Continuing with the article, according to a 2013 study published by the Journal of Geophysical Research, Atmospheres, if geoengineering programs were started and then suddenly halted, the planet could see an immediate rise in temperatures, particularly over land. The study, titled "The Impact of Abrupt Suspension of Solar Radiation Management," seems to indicate that once you begin geoengineering, you cannot suspend the programs without causing the very problem you are seeking to resolve. This is called double catastrophe scenario. Once you start climate engineering, you begin to load so much energy into the system that when you stop, the backlash will be horrific. And that's exactly what we face now. But that backlash must be allowed to happen, because the philosophy of this study and these scientists from the Journal of Geophysical Research, with their philosophy, would be like telling a drug addict, once you start, you can never stop. No matter how much destruction and carnage you cause, you have to keep doing it. That's their philosophy. We don't have a choice in the matter. We never had a choice. The military-industrial complex chooses for us, and that choice has been made. And now the only only way forward we have is to allow that backlash to happen and stop climate engineering while there's anything left of the planet. Final paragraph of this study. What are the solutions to the many ecological and environmental problems facing humanity? The studies indicate that the attempt to play God with the weather will have disastrous consequences on the ability of the human population to live and prosper. If you fear the result of mad scientists controlling the weather or pursuing dangerous solutions like geoengineering, please share this article and continue to spread knowledge. It's time for awakened people of this earth to stand together and seek solutions that work with Earth rather than seeking to dominate and exploit it. Yes, what a novel idea. Let's not fight nature. Let's not play God with the weather. Let's not rain toxic materials down all over the planet for every single living organism to absorb and assimilate. And that's the situation we're in right now. On that note, another recent headline I could put on the back pages of most mainstream media: ocean life cut in half over the last 40 years. How many people saw that headline? Ocean life cut in half. In fact, we already know that global wildlife populations overall have been cut by at least 2/3 in the last 40 years. How many people think that can continue? I challenge anyone to please research this online. Ocean life cut in half in the last 40 years. And here's an excerpt from, in fact, that article. In less than a human generation, we can see dramatic losses in ocean life. They have declined by half, and their habitats have been degraded and destroyed, said Mr. Brad Ack, Senior Vice President for Oceans at World Wildlife Federation. Quoting again, driving all these trends are human actions from overfishing, resource depletion, coastal development, and pollution to greenhouse gas emissions causing ocean acidification and warming. Of course, you don't have any of these top scientists at World Wildlife Federation, MIT, or anywhere else. They will not admit to the geoengineering elephant in the room, to the ocean fertilization that is acidifying the ocean at a radical pace, forcing the ocean to absorb more carbon, which is killing the ocean. And anybody who doesn't think the ocean is dying, go to our coast here on California and look for some sea lions and see how many you find. When we know that 10 to 15,000 at the beginning of this year alone washed up on the shores, dead. The entire food chain is collapsing. Don't believe me? Research it. My purpose in this show is not to have anybody believe anything I say, but it's simply to cause people to actually research while there's still something left to salvage, to show some responsibility. Put aside the golf club and go get in front of your computer and find out what's going on, because you're not going to find it from Fox News or CNN or MSNBC. You're not going to learn what's going on from those paid corporate WMD, weapons of mass distraction. That's what they are. Another extremely dire headline that few heard from mainstream media, I'm sure. Since the dawn of man, over half of Earth's trees, that's more than 3 trillion, by the way, are gone. Half are gone. Trees are a miraculous organism. They're a primary pillar in the web of life on our once thriving planet. They're essential to our life on this planet. They perform countless essential functions, including sequestering carbon from the atmosphere and releasing oxygen. You don't hear the geoengineers talking much about planting trees, because that simply wouldn't make them the money that they pursue. They want to seed the atmosphere with toxic particulates to block the sun, instead of planting trees which absorb carbon and release oxygen, because they couldn't make money doing that. And that's the sort of blind insanity that we live with. Not only have we already lost over 3 trillion trees during the Anthropocene era. The Anthropocene era is the age of man. That's a scientific term for the age of man. And we've lost over 3 trillion trees during that age. The trees that remain are dying at blinding speed. No mainstream article dares to mention the climate engineering factor in regard to the catastrophic tree dry-off, even though this factor is mathematically the greatest and most destructive of all to trees. Now, let's try to put all this together, all these dots together, on issues that many would think are not connected, but they are connected. How does 9/11 connect to the toppling of the numerous Middle Eastern countries? What do these countries have to do with the bigger picture, geopolitical objectives of the Western power structure, specifically the U.S., every one of the destabilized Middle Eastern countries was subjected to record protracted drought before being brought down. How does weather warfare fit into this equation? Again, it is used against countries that are considered adversarial. And it's not just the U.S. using it. We have other countries as well heavily involved in climate modification. There's collaboration between these countries, the major countries as well. We've had the leaders of nations on the floor of the UN, Middle Eastern nations, stating on the record that their countries were being droughted out by NATO weather modification programs. Search it online. Iranian leaders on floor of UN speaking out about NATO weather modification. You'll find data on this. Now, to weave all this together, let's look backward a bit at the Grand Chessboard, a book by Brzezinski, which outlines the U.S. strategy for total global dominance. Here's the definition for the Grand Chessboard. For American primacy and its geostrategic imperatives. This is one of the major works by Zbigniew Brzezinski. Brzezinski graduated with a PhD from Harvard University in 1953 and became professor of American foreign policy at Johns Hopkins University before becoming the United States National Security Advisor in 1977. Now, it's important to remember that Brzezinski is an insider that is still advising the power structure today. If you don't know who he is, look him up. Brzezinski's strategy laid out in the Grand Chessboard appears to be the exact game plan being followed by the U.S. military-industrial complex. Regarding the landmass of Eurasia as the center of global power, Brzezinski sets out to formulate a Eurasian geostrategy for the United States. In particular, he writes, "It is an imperative that no Eurasian challenger should emerge capable of dominating Eurasia and thus also of challenging America's global preeminence." Much of Brzezinski's analysis is concerned with geostrategy in Central Asia, focusing on exercise of power in the Eurasian landmass in a post-Soviet environment. Brzezinski sets the tone for his strategy by describing Russia and China as the two most important countries, almost but not quite superpowers, whose interests that might threaten the U.S. in Central Asia. Of the two, Brzezinski considers Russia to be more serious a threat. Both nations border Central Asia. In a lesser context, he describes Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Iran, Kazakhstan as essentially lesser nations that must be managed by the U.S. as buffers or counterweights to Russian and Chinese moves to control the oil, gas, and minerals of Central Asian republics. Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. He also notes, Brzezinski notes quite clearly, that any nation that might become predominant in Central Asia would directly threaten the current U.S. control of oil resources in the Persian Gulf. In reading the book, The Grand Chessboard, it's clear why the U.S. had a direct motive for looting some of the $300 billion in Russian assets during the 1990s, destabilizing Russia's currency in 1998, and ensuring that a weakened Russia would have to look westward to Europe for economic and political survival, rather than southward to Central Asia. A dependent Russia would lack the military, economic, and political clout to exert influence in the region. And this weakening of Russia would explain why Russian President Vladimir Putin has been, at least in the past, a willing ally of the U.S. efforts. Previously, this is, of course, no longer the case. An examination of selected quotes from the Grand Chessboard in the context of current events reveals the darker agenda behind the military operations that were planned long before September 11th, 2001. This is important to understand and consider. These wheels were turning long before that event. Direct quote from Brzezinski's Grand Chessboard. "It is imperative that no Eurasian challenger emerges, again, capable of dominating Eurasia. The formulation of a comprehensive and integrated Eurasian geostrategy is therefore the purpose of this book." Another quote from the grand chessboard. The attitude of the American public toward the external projection of American power has been much more ambivalent. The public supported America's engagement in World War II largely because of the shock effect of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Again, it's imperative to understand who is writing this. Who is Brzezinski? He is considered the insider advisor to the U.S. power structure. That's who he is. That's who's writing this. This is not some fringe author who is not part of the equation. This is the hub of the equation writing this. Another quote. Moreover, as America becomes increasingly multicultural society, it may find it more difficult to fashion a consensus on foreign policy issues, except in the circumstances of a truly massive and widely perceived direct external threat. Let's keep 9/11 in mind. All of this was written prior to 9/11. Brzezinski is basically saying we need a major cataclysmic event that will strike fear into the American population. That's exactly what he's saying. Now, the next comments come from someone who worked with Brzezinski, Dr. Johannes Koppel, PhD, a former German Defense Ministry official, advisor to NATO Secretary General Manfred Werner. And Koppel says, Brzezinski's book is sublimely arrogant. While singing the praises of the IMF and the World Bank, which have economically terrorized nations on every continent, and while totally ignoring the worldwide terrorist actions of the U.S. government that have led to genocide, cluster bombings of civilian populations from Kosovo to Laos to Iraq to Afghanistan, the development and battlefield use of both biological and chemical agents such as sarin gas, and the financial rape of entire cultures, it would leave the reader believing that such actions are for the good of mankind. This is Koppel's comment about Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard. Brzezinski, again, hub of global power structure. He is the advisor from the Carter administration till now. Look him up, learn who he is, learn his part in this play. And he describes the kind of atrocities that Koppel just described in a way that would leave the reader to believe that such actions are for the good of mankind, because that's what the power structure, those that are truly at the top, they feel they have the right to play God. They feel they have the right to decide who lives, who dies. People like Kissinger, who state on the record that when you control energy, when you control food supplies, you control the people, and that's what they want, control. They can never get enough. Again, how do we weave all this together when we have these various components of Brzezinski's strategy, the grand chessboard, 9/11, weather warfare, the forming, funding, and arming of terrorist groups like by the Western powers like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, destabilization of the Middle East, now the refugee crisis. Let's add one more piece to the puzzle to lend credence to the plan laid out by Brzezinski. We had confirmation from General Wesley Clark. All this can be looked up online as well. Direct quotes from Wesley Clark of what he was told, that the plans of the administration, that Syrian war was planned since 1991. Part of Brzezinski's plan, again, to destabilize these nations, to topple them, to allow them to be more easily controlled. We have General Wesley Clark confirming these plans. We have General Wesley Clark confirming that he was told the plan was to take out 7 countries in 5 years, all the Middle Eastern countries that we see toppling. There's lots of data out there. Lots of records for anybody who cares to look, for anybody who cares to turn off the mainstream media machine of total distraction and disinformation with all the props they have in their plays, from Weather Channel to Fox to MSNBC and CNN. It's a circus of insanity on our media. And if that's where you're getting your information, you don't have a clue what's going on. Not a clue. And if you've bought the lie that you can't find out anything on the internet, you can find sources of information that are the frontline sources. Yes, there's disinformation there, but there's also direct information. In fact, it's the only source of direct information we have, because you're sure not going to get it from mainstream media. So as we put all this together, these plans that have been laid out over such a long period of time to destabilize the Middle East, to gain control of the resources, none of this is about freedom and democracy. And again, I salute our military brothers and sisters that have signed up for honorable reasons. I salute them. I want them to know that. But I'm asking them at the same time, if you truly signed up for the good of your country, you have a responsibility to find out what's going on, to find out what you're a part of, to find out what you're being used for. You have a responsibility to do this. So, as we put this all together, the intent to destabilize the Middle East, the statement from think tanks like PNAC, Project for a New American Century, using the outline from Brzezinski and stating on the record that they needed a new Pearl Harbor. They needed a Pearl Harbor type-like event in order to advance their agenda of militarization and occupation. And then we have 9/11. 9/11 that doesn't have any official explanation that holds any water. And now we have everything laid out by Brzezinski taking form. And part of the destabilization of those countries back to weather warfare. Every single Middle Eastern country that has been destabilized and has now collapsed was subjected to record drought prior to that destabilization. Record drought causes societal disruption. When people don't have enough water, they're a little unruly. And that's what we've had happening. Then we have the formation of these terror groups that are also used to destabilize these countries. Happening right now in Syria. This is truly becoming an incredible display of criminality that traces right back to our own country. If you don't really understand what's happening in Syria, you need to. And again, you're not going to learn this on Fox or CNN or MSNBC or any of the mainstream sources. There's an article from Tony Cartolucci. This was on Global Research again. Great article. I salute Tony for this article. And he outlines very well what we have happening in the Middle East right now. Good summation that incorporates the dots we've already connected, the strategies that were laid out long before 9/11 that are taking place now, that involve the greatest weapon of all that the power structure holds, weather warfare, which is also biological warfare, control of food supplies, water supplies, all that plugs into this equation. And it's being done right now to the American population, right, by the way. Because those in power, those who are really in power, are not there for the benefit of the U.S. population. They are there for their own agenda. And they see the population not just as expendable, but as a liability. I'll continue with Tony Cartolucci's article. Great article. Social Engineering 101. How to make a refugee crisis. Destruction of all prevailing political orders in the Middle East. Starting in 2007, the U.S. was already in the process of engineering the overthrow and destruction of all prevailing political orders across the Middle East and North Africa. To undermine Iran, which is predominantly Shiite, the Bush administration decided to, in effect, reconfigure its priorities in the Middle East. In Lebanon, the administration has cooperated with Saudi Arabia's government, which is Sunni. Again, warring tribal factions is something that has been exploited by the Western power structure to help further destabilize countries. In clandestine operations that are intended to weaken Hezbollah, the Shiite organization that is backed by Iran. The U.S. has also taken part in clandestine operations aimed at Iran and its ally in Syria. Again, the taking down of the Middle East, the destabilization of the Middle East. And a byproduct of these activities has been the bolstering of Sunni extremist groups that espouse a militant vision of Islam and are hostile to America and sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. Are these terrorist groups dangerous? Of course they're dangerous. They're extremely dangerous. But who spawned them? Who funded them? Who armed them? Back to that question. Back to the grand chessboard. Back to those in power that are willing to do anything to accomplish their goals. The article continues. Journalist Seymour Hersh also revealed that at the time, the U.S. then, under the administration of President George Bush, and through intermediaries, including U.S. ally Saudi Arabia, had already begun channeling funding and support to the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, who would in 2011 play a crucial role in the opening phases of the destructive war now raging across Levant. Is this whole equation complicated? Yes, it's very complicated. It's not the simple we're good, they're bad equation that mainstream media feeds you on the news every night. That's an absolute lie. If you think those in power of the largest military in the world, by far, 10 times bigger than any other military, it's as big as the next 10 militaries combined. If you think that there are honorable people running this juggernaut of insanity, then you're not living in reality. Look around you and stop watching mainstream media propaganda. Continuing with this report, in 2008, from Libya to Syria and beyond, activists were drawn by the U.S. State Department from across the Middle East and North Africa to learn the finer points of Washington and Wall Street's, quote, color revolution. In other words, our government was training people to become part of these terrorist groups. The same happened in South America. Another story completely. But this is business as usual. Continuing with the report, they were being prepared for an unprecedented, coordinated, U.S.-engineered, Middle East, North Africa-wide campaign of political destabilization that would in 2011 be called the Arab Spring. Though the U.S. State Department National Endowment for Democracy, acronym is NED, and the U.S. State Department's movements.org were literally flown on several occasions to both New York and Washington, D.C., as well as other locations around the globe to receive training, equipment, and funding before returning to their home countries and attempting to overthrow their respective governments. Our government was taking certain groups, training them, sending them home to overthrow their governments. This is historical fact. Continuing with the report, an April 2011 article published by the New York Times titled, U.S. Groups Helped Nurture Arab Uprisings. It was admitted from the report directly, a number of the groups and individuals directly involved in the revolts and reforms sweeping the region, including the April 6th youth movement in Egypt, the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, and grassroots activists like Instar Qadi, have a hard time pronouncing that, a youth leader in Yemen, received training and financing from groups like the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, and the Freedman House, a non-profit human rights organization based in Washington, just front groups. And this ought to make it clear that it doesn't matter whether we're talking about Democrats or Republicans. It makes no difference. It's two sides to the same coin. How long will people fall for that facade? Election after election after election, rigged elections. It makes no difference. All these people are funding groups that are then used to destabilize and topple nations. Continuing with the report, they were created by Congress and are financed through the National Endowment for Democracy, which was set up in 1983 to channel grants from promoting democracy in developing nations. The National Endowment receives about $100 million annually from Congress. Freedman House also gets the bulk of its money from American government, mainly from the State Department. Continuing with reports, it is clear that the political cover, the Arab Spring, and the premeditated support of terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda, brought in afterward, were planned years before the Arab Spring actually unfolded in 2011. The goal was admittedly the overthrow of governments obstructing Washington and Wall Street's hegemonic ambitions, and part of a much wider agenda of isolating, encircling, and containing Russia and China. The destruction of the Middle Eastern and North African region was intentional, premeditated, and continues on to this very day. As the wave of regime change crashes, since 2011, each and every one of the West's color revolutions has predictably devolved into armies of U.S.-backed terrorists attempting to divide and destroy each nation, back to Brzezinski's grand chessboard. In Libya, this goal has already long since been accomplished. In Egypt and Syria, with varying degrees of failure, this agenda has been stalled. Egypt, through sheer virtue of its size and the capabilities of its military, has prevented nationwide warfare. In Syria, Facing invasion primarily from both Turkey and Jordan, violence has been far more dramatic and enduring. But despite initial euphoria across the West that their insidious conspiracy had indeed upended the Middle Eastern and North African region entirely, Syria's ability to resist the West's proxy forces and now more direct intervention has entirely disrupted this wave of regime change. U.S. Senator John McCain, who literally posed for pictures with terrorist leaders in both Libya and Syria, including the now head of the so-called Islamic State, ISIS, in Libya, Abdul Hakim Bahal, at the height of the Arab Spring, prematurely taunted Moscow and Beijing with threats to bring similarly U.S.-orchestrated chaos in their direction. Suffice to say, Moscow and Beijing were not only ready for this destabilization, they were prepared to foil it before it so much as reached their borders. And as momentum stalled, the U.S. and its regional collaborators attempted to justify direct military action in Syria first, as they did in Libya, by claiming they would be averting a humanitarian disaster and assisting, quote, freedom fighters. Again, we're talking about Al-Qaeda and ISIS. However, with the crimes the U.S. and NATO perpetuated in Libya still fresh in the global public's minds, this narrative was entirely untenable. Staged chemical weapon attacks were perpetrated on the outskirts of Damascus under the nose of UN inspectors in a bid to frame the government of Damascus and again justify direct U.S. military intervention against Syria. Again, the global public, recalling similar fabrications peddled by the West ahead of its 10-year invasion and occupation of Iraq, along with expert diplomacy by Moscow, averted a war. Of course, Syria would not use chemical weapons when the UN chemical weapons inspectors were already there on the ground. Why would they do that? You have to ask about motive. When we're fed a story like that, and it's propagated by our mainstream media, corporate, industrial, military complex lapdogs, ask yourself if it makes sense. Continuing with this report, and while it is increasingly obvious that Al-Qaeda and ISIS' presence in Syria and Iraq is the direct, premeditated result of U.S., NATO, and their regional allies' sponsorship of both groups, the West has attempted to use them as a pretext for direct military intervention not only in Syria, but again against the government of Damascus itself. They are trying to carry out the plan laid out long before 9/11, the plan laid out by Brzezinski, the grand chessboard. All of this is part of the same play. Report continues. Let's cue the refugees now that we see on every headline. As this last attempt to justify final push toward regime change in Syria falters, and as Europe powers begin deciding whether or not to intervene further in Syria alongside the U.S., a sudden and convenient deluge of refugees has flooded Europe, almost as if on cue. Scenes like that out of a movie showed hordes of tattered refugees herded along various borders as they apparently appeared out of what the Western media has portrayed as a puff of smoke at Europe's gates. In reality, they did not appear out of a puff of smoke. They appeared in Turkey, a NATO member since 1950 and one of America's closest regional allies. Turkey is currently hosting the U.S. military, including special forces and the CIA, who have, together with Turkish military and intelligence agencies, been conducting a proxy war on neighboring Syria since 2011. Turkey has suspiciously maintained a very enthusiastic open-door policy for refugees, spending inexplicable sums of money and political capital in accommodating them. They were building up for this. This is all part of a grand plan, the grand chessboard. The Brookings Institute, one of the chief policy think tanks helping engineer the proxy war with Syria, reported in its July 2015 quote, Order Out of Chaos article. What Turkey's open-door policy means for Syria refugees is that Turkey is now the world's largest recipient of refugees since October 2013. They've been building them up there for a long time. The number of Syrian refugees has increased more than threefold, and now the number's almost 2 million registered refugees. This has been built up, prepared for a long time. This crisis is not something that was not expected and planned. Brookings also reports that the cost has been high to Turkey government. Officials are quick to point out that they have spent over $6 billion with a B, on refugees and complain about the lack of international support. The pawns of war. Clearly, Turkey lacks any altruistic motivation behind its refugee policy. Turkey is one of the chief facilitators of terrorists operating in Syria. This is one of our allies, Turkey. They're one of the chief facilitators of terrorists and primary collaborator in NATO's proxy war against its neighbor. Turkey has allowed literally hundreds of supply trucks a day to cross its borders uninhibited and destined for ISIS territory. Turkey has also been asked throughout various U.S. policy papers with establishing a buffer zone or safe haven to move these refugees into, as well as establishing a Syrian-based stronghold for NATO's terrorist proxies to launch military operations from. How can our country convince the population that it's okay to arm, fund, and back terrorists and terrorist groups that are used to destabilize nations, to create chaos, used to cause the population to live in fear here at home? We have to look back at who spawned those, and how far back in history do we have to look? How many of these types of groups or this type of fear have we had pushed on the American population? Wasn't Saddam Hussein going to bomb us? Then Korea was going to bomb us. Now we have ISIS flooding in with refugees that are being allowed into our country. None of this is an accident. It's not an accident. When will the American public wake up and realize the degree to which they're being manipulated? When will the U.S. military, our brothers and sisters in the U.S. military, stop, look around, understand what they're being used for, and that these global incidents are not accidental? And none of this to say the toppling of these governments has caused chaos. And this chaos plays right into the plans that have been laid out over such an incredibly long period of time to be manipulated by those in power for their specific purposes. To continue from the report, catastrophes that are meant to look sudden and unexpected, as well as, quote, unstoppable, are in fact allowed to unfold within an operational theater completely controlled by the U.S. and NATO, constitutes instead a conspiracy pitting desperate and/or exploited refugees intentionally sent out of Turkey into Europe against a manipulated, fearful, and ill-informed Western public. Extremely ill-informed, because they're feeding from the trough of the corporate media propaganda machine. The final paragraph of this report, social engineering versus the inevitable rot of empire. A refugee crisis was inevitable, regardless of the timing and magnitude of any given deluge that may have been created or manipulated by the West. Destroying the planet in pursuit of empire, pillaging nations, hauling away the wealth of the world inevitably leads to endless streams of victims, following their stolen wealth back to the thieves' den. As an empire expands, and the list of its victims expands with it, the number of those an empire is able to fully assimilate versus those who will inevitably overwhelm it tips the balance against the empire. Such was the fate with the Roman Empire, which over the course of its decline had its institutions overwhelmed by peoples it had conquered faster than it could assimilate them. For the West, it has chosen confrontation rather than cooperation. The West has closed economic ties with Russia, alienated China, and wages a ceaseless war across the Middle East and North Africa region and Central Asia. It pursues a now exposed campaign of divide and conquer across Southeast Asia, augmented with terrorism and political subversion, all while neglecting every virtue that ever made it a respected global power to begin with. How much of the most recent refugee crisis is social engineering versus simply the inevitable rot of empire is difficult to tell, though the fact that social engineers would be tempted to use a vast number of refugees created by their own foreign policy indicates that their ploy in and of itself is indicative of immense, irreversible geopolitical rot. Again, my thanks to Tony Cartolucci for that report. Sign off. Brzezinski's grand chessboard strategy has long been implemented by the Western power structure and the U.S. government, though with every passing day the pushback against the insanity grows. To be clear, other governments around the globe are also buried in criminality and corruption as well. The level of tyranny is generally comparable to the military strength of the nation, in question, there's clearly a collusion between the many governments, even competing governments, on issues like the ongoing climate engineering insanity. In regard to the U.S. military and our brothers and sisters that are part of it, the world needs you to wake up and educate yourself on the bigger picture. I salute the motives that most of you have signed up and served for. But those in power are using your honorable service toward a destructive end, not just destructive to other countries around the globe, but destructive to your own countrymen. I ask you to please educate yourself on what's really going on, what those in power are really doing, how this fits into the grand picture with all the dots that I've just tried to connect. For those listening to the show, please wipe away your bias, wipe away your preconception. If you don't look through a clear lens, you're not going to see a clear picture. It's up to all of us to find out what's really going on and not to march forward with an opinion that's based on propaganda. Please educate yourself. It's not an option. It's a responsibility. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington for GeoEngineeringWatch.org and Global Alert News. Thank you.